taking an inside look at inner child work. Shadow work and inner child work share a lot of common ground, and in fact become much the same process when we are facing our unattended childhood programming and imprinting. Our inner child is the expression and personification of two factors that are in close conjunction. One, the intrinsically good qualities of early childhood. And two, our early conditioning. These aspects of such conditioning that are unresolved or hidden are part of our shadow. So working in any depth with our inner child includes, to whatever degree, working with our shadow. And shadow work has to include working with our inner child. After all, childhood is when most of our conditioning was originally implanted. Further, sometimes our inner child itself is kept in our shadow, however partially. So if you're wondering, what is the inner child? First of all, it's not an entity, not an indwelling being, but rather an activity, a personified, memory-saturated process, however much we might relate to it as though it's a discrete somebody. It's a literal child. Even so, the fact that the inner child is an interior process doesn't make it any less real or less childlike. And the inner child's qualities include innocence, playfulness, curiosity, wonder, extreme openness, vulnerability, and permeability. Our inner child expresses both our essential purity and our original conditioning. The inner child is both pure and sullied. Pure in the sense of primal innocence and openness. Sullied in the sense of containing our early woundedness and fears. That is, it's both unconditioned and conditioned. And again, much of our inner child may be in our shadow. Pushing away or denying the child within just separates us from our unresolved wounding and unmet needs, leaving those old conditioning intact. Thereby we unknowingly let it run us from behind the scenes, however free from it we may think we are. Contacting and feeling, that is feeling into, feeling for, and feeling with our inner child brings us closer not only to who we were in our early years, but also to the conditioning that got implanted in us then. The inner child exists in all of us. We may identify with it, deny it, pamper it, blame it, abuse it, or think it's just an idea. But it's not going to go away, because it's an essential part of us, no matter how much we push it into our shadow. To not know our inner child keeps us fragmented, emotionally impoverished, cut off from our deeper vulnerability and openness, while our original woundedness, shadow-bound, continues to direct us. And some of the signs that your inner child has shown up as you're going about your day include reactivity. When you're reactive, reverting to knee-jerk reactions, emotionally disappropriate behavior, the wounded child in us is taking center stage, showing up through our speech, movements, intentions, and manner of relating. One of the quickest ways to interrupt our reactivity is to admit to ourselves the child in us has shown up. This gives us access to a perspective other than that of the child's. And as we realize that the child's wounding has been triggered and has successfully enlisted our adult capacity to argue and rationalize, we begin diffusing our reactivity. The second sign is freezing. When we sense danger and an absence of safety, we're immediately mobilized to fight, flee, or freeze. Fear is present, but even more so is numbness. When we freeze during intense, confrontational, or strongly emotional times, it usually indicates that the child in us has been activated and we are caught in the same behavioral default as we were when we felt frightened or overwhelmed in our early years. Another sign is an exaggerated sense of abandonment or rejection. A sense of abandonment can start very early in life. And when we drop into this mood of abandonment or rejection, when we're not actually being abandoned or rejected in any significant sense, it's the child in us. We're looking through the eyes of that child. And the next sign is an overwhelming sense of existential helplessness. This sense may be characterized by us throwing up our hands in the air and sinking into what's the point depressiveness when our circumstances actually aren't all that bad. There were times in many cases when we as young children or infants were in a no-exit situation that were far from pleasant, and the only solution was to mute our vital signs, not to respond. We don't fight, flee, or freeze, but we chose to collapse. Now the next sign is magical thinking. Magical thinking is a mode of pre-rational cognition in which we assume that we have or can have a causal role in events that we actually have no control over. This way of thinking is entirely natural in early childhood. And it shows up in adulthood in various forms. The next sign is a sudden surge of disproportionate rage or defensiveness. And this kind of reaction is very common, and just as commonly it's taken to be something over which we have no control. The root of such rage or defensiveness may be shame, or a sense of being shamed, or the surfacing of what couldn't be expressed in early life trauma. And another sign is egocentric behavior. Being egocentric is entirely natural to a young child. It's a developmental stage and may coexist with altruism. Its workings are transparent. You can see the wheels turning. The problem is when such behavior follows us into adulthood and is a love to squat upon the throne of self. The next sign is goalless spontaneity, wordless wonder, pure joy. These and related states can arise without any regression to childhood, but when they do, the child in us is alive. It's well, and it's shining bright. We're playing like no one is watching or overseeing us. When the innocence of the child within and the awakened innocence of the real maturity meet, we're truly plugged in. We're truly at home in our wholeness. So how do we work with our inner child? The first step is to get to know your inner child. Acknowledge its presence and your feelings towards it, including if such feelings are mixed or seemingly non-existent. Many don't want to get close to their inner child because of painful associations they have with their early development years. Initially, we might not feel connected to our inner child. Identifying what is about that little one that bothers us or turns us off in an important step. It's an important step to take. For example, your inner child is needy and you find this neediness distasteful or embarrassing. You can look back and see what your childhood neediness resulted from. What you don't like about your inner child is very likely what significant others didn't like about you when you were a child. And when you realize that this dislike originates from not in you, but in these others, and also is probably a defining characteristic of your inner critic, then you can reassess whatever aversion you have to your inner child and begin responding to her or him the way you would to anybody who's shamed or a beaten down child. The second step to work with your inner child is to cultivate empathy. Empathy towards your inner child. It can be helpful to visualize a child other than the child you once were in clearly different, difficult circumstances. Perhaps as your own son or daughter, or the child or grandchild of a dear friend. A child that you feel a natural affinity for. And then let your caring and concern for the child arise and spread through you. Once there's no doubt that you're experiencing such feelings, immediately transfer this focus and feelings to the child you were, to the child you're still carrying inside, as if you're caringly and protectively present with that little one. Doing this practice over and over will help bring you closer to that inner child and its reality, so that its pain becomes something not to avoid or distract yourself from, but to approach step by step consciously with compassion. You're both experiencing the feelings expressed and unexpressed of your inner child and holding them without getting lost in them, like a good parent. You're entering a lucid empathy, emotionally resonating with the child in you, while at the same time not identifying with that one. The third step is to commit to your inner child. Remember the child within daily, keeping an emotionally alive contact with him or her. The more you can access and live this state, the more deeply and effectively you can encounter and work with your early conditioning. You can become a safe space, a conducive environment in which your original wounding, primal imprints, default behaviors, and the core programming can be more and more fully exposed and worked with until they no longer drive you. The fourth step. Continue both to love and protect your inner child. Once you see your inner child and its dynamics clearly, and your empathy for it thrives, it becomes second nature, both to bring your inner child fully into your heart and to protect him or her, especially in ways that he or she wasn't but needed to in those early years. the more room you make for your inner child without identifying or fusing with her or him, the more you thrive, generating an environment in which the very deepest work can be done, work that makes you fully human. About protecting your inner child, it's important to be far more of a guardian than a guard. It's more important to be a guardian than a guard. Because our inner child doesn't need to be housed in a fortress. Whatever we do with our inner child, it's not going to go away, nor should it. It's not in the way of our maturation. Loving that part of us, not as an abstraction, but as a living reality, keeps us grounded in our humanity, as does taking good care of him or her. This is a key part of being wise stewards of all that we are, choosing connection with rather than dissociation from our various elements. Cultivating a full-hearted relationship with our inner child is one of the very best things we can do for ourselves. It greatly deepens our capacity to be in truly healthy relationships. We don't outgrow our child within, but instead outgrow our dysfunctional ways of being with that little one. Our ongoing intimacy with our inner child becomes a gift to one and all. As we bring this practice to a close, notice for yourself how you feel right now. And ask yourself, what was the one thing that you heard today that struck a deep chord with you? What's the one thing that resonated deeply? But I want you to please go ahead and share that one thing in the comments.